Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Franklin Pierce, and the focus is Bleeding Kansas. The year is 1855, it's August. Woodsen Shannon has taken over as the territorial governor of Kansas, replacing Andrew Reeder, and he's facing a situation of chaos. There are rival governments that are now emerging within the territory. The pro-slavery government, based on the official elections that Shannon recognized, but then down the road in Topeka, you had the Free Soilers coming up with their own government. They sent their own delegate to Congress. They came up with their own constitution, and in January of 1856, they elected Charles Robinson as the territorial governor as far as they were concerned. Well, again, Woodsen Shannon, the governor appointed by President Pierce, did not recognize the Free Soil government, and neither did Pierce. Pierce sent a special message to Congress on this topic to make his point clear. He said whatever irregularities may have occurred, it was too late now to raise that question. For all present purposes, the legislative body thus constituted and elected was the legitimate authority of the territory. That was the pro-slavery government. Well, what to do about all of this? Could federal troops become involved? Well, Pierce was also pretty clear on this. Potentially, yes, but only under very special circumstances, a violation of federal law or some kind of insurrection against the local government, then federal troops could come into play, but he still saw this as a local issue. He expected the local people to figure it out. Well, this didn't help very much as both camps were starting to arm up and violence was going to be in the air and Shannon was trying to figure out what to do. The Free Soil state government convened on March the 4th. It quickly adjourned, said we're coming back on July the 4th where we will stand up our government for sure. And in the meantime, you basically had guerrilla warfare. Governor Shannon was basically ineffective. He had no credibility with the Free Soilers. He couldn't stop the pro-slavery folks in their incursions against the incursions coming from the neighbor states. The federal judicial system also aligned with the pro-slavery folks, and they took a bold step forward to indict Andrew Reeder, Charles Robinson, and another Free Soiler leader, James Lane, invite them for treason, punishable by death. Robinson was the only one in the territory at the time, but he was arrested, and more violence ensued. Next step, pro-slavery Sheriff Samuel Jones was in Lawrence, Kansas, and he was struck by gunfire. Well, the governor, Shannon, appealed to the President of the United States. Can you help us here? We've got gunfire, we've got violence. Well, Pierce responded that the laws must be executed, but military force should not be employed until after the marshal has met with actual resistance in the fulfillment of his duty, maintain the laws firmly and impartially, and take care that no good citizen has just ground to complain of the want of protection. This was not very helpful. He's basically saying again, keep it local, solve the problem, and the locals were going to be unable to do that. It was simply getting out of control, but Franklin Pierce was not being very helpful. So what did Sheriff Jones do? Well, he led a posse into Lawrence, Kansas, and went about demolishing the opposition. They demolished the newspaper, they demolished the Free State Hotel, and there was a retaliation then for that. An abolitionist by the name of John Brown and his sons decided to commit murder against some pro-slavery settlers. 5 of them were killed the very next day after the sacking of Lawrence, Kansas. Things are increasingly getting out of control, and this name Bleeding Kansas was starting to emerge within the vernacular. But it wasn't only bleeding in Kansas. It was also bleeding in the United States Congress. In Congress, in the Senate, Charles Sumner decided to really go on the attack against the pro-slavery factions in the Senate. He verbally assaulted a number of them, the ones who would support slavery or even popular sovereignty. He went after Stephen Douglas. He went after Andrew Butler. Well, Butler's second cousin was a congressman by the name of Preston Brooks from South Carolina. Brooks didn't like the attack on his cousin, and he made Sumner very much aware of this. He came in shortly after the speech into the floor of the Senate, and he attacked Charles Sumner with his walking stick. He pummeled him. Even after Sumner had crumpled to the floor, he continued to attack until his colleagues finally pulled him off. Sumner would mostly recover, but he would be feeling the effects of this for the rest of his life, and it certainly had the effects across the country in the violence that was ensuing in the United States Congress. Meanwhile, this was also an election year. It's now 1856, and the United States citizenry was going to send a new person to the White House, or could it be Franklin Pierce getting another chance? Well, despite all this chaos, Pierce was proud of his accomplishments and his adherence to the law, popular sovereignty, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act. But those were also the main reasons why he was so despised in so many parts of the country. It was really difficult to see how he could possibly have a constituency from either the North or the South that would support him for the nomination. More popular in the South, but not wholly there either, and increasingly unpopular in the North. Well, that Democratic convention did meet in June of 1856. They met in Cincinnati, the first time a major convention for a political party in the United States met west of the Appalachian Mountains. And they opened up with the voting with 122 votes for Franklin Pierce. Not a bad showing. He was 13 behind James Buchanan. Buchanan had kind of had an advantage in all of this in that he had been out of sight, out of mind for the last several years. He had been serving as the minister to Great Britain. He had a long resume, he'd been in cabinet, he'd been in the Congress, but he was not around while a lot of the most recent angst was occurring in Kansas, so he was a little bit untainted from that, which in this case was to his advantage. You've got Buchanan in the mix, you've got Pierce in the mix, you've got the 2/3 rule, so there's going to be a very high bar for anybody to get there. And Pierce, frankly, started to fade pretty quickly after that first ballot. By the 6th, he was really starting to fall. After the 14th, still nobody had gotten to the 2/3 level, so they adjourned for the day, but Pierce saw the writing on the wall. He had been following this by telegraph the entire time, and that night he eventually decided to withdraw. That left Stephen Douglas as really the only viable candidate against Buchanan. Pierce was actually hoping that Douglas and popular sovereignty, they were aligned on that topic, that maybe Douglas could get the nomination. He got a little bit of a rise when Pierce stepped out, but it wasn't enough. He saw the writing on the wall, he stepped out as well, and Buchanan became the nominee for the Democrats. As for Pierce's reaction, we hear from William Marcy that the president bears his disappointment manfully. He has now, I believe, less confidence in the faith of men than he had before the convention, but he did accept his fate, but he still had plenty to do in the rest of his presidency, because Kansas continued to bleed. Finally, Pierce agreed that he did need more of a military presence, and he put General Persifor Smith in charge. He also fired Governor Shannon. He thought he was ineffective, and he nominated John Geary of Pennsylvania to take over as the territorial governor, trying to make some changes to see if he could calm what was still a bleeding Kansas scenario. Well, there was a gap of a month before Geary would actually be confirmed and show up in Kansas, and this turned out to be the most violent month so far in the entire challenge. The Secretary of State of the territory, David Woodsen, was put in charge. He was aligned with the pro-slavery faction. With all the violence occurring, he called out for the militia, which brought a whole bunch of citizen soldiers from the neighboring states to come in and fight on the pro-slavery side. You've got arming up on the free soiler side as well. And there was violence throughout this entire month. Fortunately, when Governor Geary showed up, he did calm things for a bit. He disbanded those militias. He toured the area. He brought a little bit of calm, but still things very tense on the plains of Kansas. In the meantime, Franklin Pierce, he's starting to plan his future. He took a trip home to New Hampshire, trying to figure out maybe a place to live, and he spoke to the locals, still leaning on his same ideological perspective. There is a sectional spirit in the land, counseling hatred and all uncharitableness, which threatens at this moment to rock the Union to the center. He reiterated his hope and faith in the Constitution and the preeminence of the institutions which it upholds. He was unwavering. Not really sure why he could be optimistic, though, given what was actually happening in the country. Well, after Buchanan easily triumphed in the fall canvass over the Republican John Fremont, who was the first candidate for the Republicans to run for the presidency, this brought essentially now the Pierce administration was coming to an end, and he ended up on a note in his final message to Congress with some pretty strong points, the first of which is, don't blame me for anything. He said in this message that the action in bleeding Kansas was beyond the sphere of action of the executive. The President of the United States has not power to interpose in elections, to see to their freedom, to canvass their votes, or to pass upon the legality in the territories any more than in the states. Don't blame me. Well, this was not the leadership the country was expecting from their president, but this was the strict constructionist view of Franklin Pierce, continued to see these as local matters where he wanted everyone to just get along. He also had a warning for his country, and he set this one directly to the north and the heart of the Republican Party, who he saw, frankly, as a menace. according to Pierce, about the Republicans, that they are ardently attached to liberty in the abstract. They do not stop to consider practically how the objects they would attain can be accomplished, nor to reflect that even if the evil were as great as they deem it, they have no remedy to apply, and that it can be only aggravated by their violence and unconstitutional action. Strict constructionists, stay with the Constitution. This was the mantra of Franklin Pierce to the end. It wasn't working anymore. It wasn't resonating with the people in the country, particularly in the North, but across the country and certainly on the plains of Kansas, where people are taking up arms, which in essence was the beginning of the Civil War. Sure, Fort Sumter wouldn't occur until 1861, but the violence in Kansas, this was the start of when it was no longer going to be negotiated, it was no longer going to be compromised, because the original compromise on all of this topic that Franklin Pierce and the other presidents in the 1850s, like Millard Fillmore and James Buchanan, that they counted on the compromise from 1787 in the Constitution, where to have a country, the United States and the leaders, the founding fathers agreed, we're sort of going to just let each other live their own lives when it comes to the topic of slavery. If you want it, you can have it. If you don't, stay out of it and let bygones be bygones. Well, that didn't work in the long run. It worked in the short run. And there were subsequent compromises to try to continue to persist in this single union, with slavery being part of the country but not the other. You had the Missouri Compromise in 1820. That calmed things for a while. You had the Compromise in 1850. This one was basically stillborn from the beginning, as the North was not going to accept that fugitive slave law. And now things are spiraling. Kansas-Nebraska Act, the violence in bleeding Kansas. This was the reality of the original sin of the United States, of slavery that was baked into the Constitution from the beginning. The constitutionalists no longer had an answer, because their answer was no longer acceptable to a vast majority of the American people. And that's why bleeding Kansas, under Franklin Pierce's watch, was simply a yet another accelerant on the path to national fracture. That is Franklin Pierce and Bleeding Kansas, from the life of Franklin Pierce. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.